The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, sir. I ask unanimous consent that all members have up to 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection,
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 752, the Open Book on Equal Access to Justice Act, a bill House Judiciary Committee Ranking Member Collins and I have worked on together for several years. The Equal Access to Justice Act was enacted to allow Americans to recover attorney's fees and costs associated with lawsuits against the federal government. This has enabled ordinary citizens such as veterans, seniors, small business owners, advocates for clean air and clean water, and any other type of citizen to fight unfair or illegal government actions without fear of court costs. The law has been a success. In 1995, however, an important reporting requirement was removed from it, which made it harder for the public to know how much money the government has awarded. Our bill, the Open Book on Equal Access to Justice Act, reinstates the Equal Access to Justice Act's tracking and reporting requirements with respect to payments awarded so that American people can have access to this important information. It would do this by requiring ACUS, an acronym for the Administrative Conference of the United States, a highly respected nonpartisan agency, to prepare an annual report for Congress on the fees and costs awarded in these cases. The reports would also include the number and nature of the claims involved. In summary, H.R. 752 would promote greater transparency and accountability. Accordingly, I urge my colleagues to join me and Mr. Collins in voting for this measure today, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Tennessee reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Look, there's so many times on this floor that we come down here and we talk about things that divide us. But I'll have to say, Mr. Cohen and I, we have had so many things that sometimes we don't see eye to eye on, but we're still friends. And this is one of those times when we've been pursuing this one for a long time. This is a bill that I have been very privileged to have him be a part of and sponsor. And H.R. 752, the Open Book on Equal Access to Justice Act, is to provide transparency and oversight for taxpayer dollars awarded under the Equal Access to Justice Act. But all of the folks who have been co-sponsors on this, Mr. Cohen has stood out among all, and he has been such a great supporter of this, and it is good to have him with this, managing this bill. But I'd also like to thank Representatives Cheney and Peterson for being original co-sponsors and their continued leadership on this. But also, Mr. Speaker, because this, I believe, is something we should have passed last Congress. We went ahead and we worked it, and also today we're also excited to also have identical legislation that has been introduced in the Senate by Senators Barrasso and Coons. This bill has previously passed the House unanimously. It is common sense and restores congressional and public oversight. Congress originally passed the Equal Access to Justice Act in 1980 to remove a barrier to justice for those with limited access to the resources it takes to sue the federal government and to recover attorney's fees and costs that go along with such suits. The law was meant to give citizens the ability to challenge or defend against unreasonable government actions where they might otherwise be deterred or unable to do so because of large legal expenses. The Equal Access to Justice Act was intended for true David and Goliath scenarios where a wrong citizen is facing a federal government of vast resources. This law has been on the books for decades and remains important. However, in 1995, tracking and reporting requirements on the payments under the law have been halted. Without a comprehensive federal report on the total amount of fees under the law, we have fallen behind in oversight responsibilities and can't tell in a meaningful way if the law is still working as intended. In fact, a Government Accountability Office report indicated that without any direction to track payments, most agencies simply do not do it. We only have an anecdotal evidence about how much we are spending on attorney's fees and the agencies paying out the fees and what types of claims are being covered. The Open Book on Equal Access to Justice Act reinstates needed transparency and accountability requirements to ensure that the Equal Access to Justice Act is helping individuals, retirees, veterans, and small businesses as intended. It requires the Administrative Conference of the United States to develop an online searchable database that includes information on the number, nature, and amount of the awards, claims involved in the controversy, and other relevant information. Agencies would be required to provide information requested by the ACUS for the development and maintenance of the database. But importantly, the ACUS would be required to withhold information from the database if the disclosure prohibited by law or court order. As I made it clear in report language in previous years, I continue to expect the ACUS to make appropriate measures to ensure that individual-specific health care information, such as individuals' diagnosis and treatments, is not contained in the database. Legislation ensures appropriate protections are in place while facilitating critical and public congressional oversight. The open book to equal access to justice places agencies' expenditures in the EAJA in the view of the watchful public eye and restores scrutiny in taxpayer dollars. Where the federal government is spending money, Congress needs to exercise oversight to ensure that it is being done in accordance with the law and congressional intent. Tracking and reporting requirements preserve the integrity of the Equal Access to Justice Act, and they will enable Congress to evaluate the law to make sure it is working effectively for those people it is intended to help. We owe it to small businesses, Social Security claimants, veterans, and similarly situated individuals faced with the daunting task of taking on the federal government who rely on the law to make sure that it is working. I look forward to continued bipartisan efforts to move this bill forward and to the Open Book on Equal Access Justice Act ultimately becoming law. The consensus behind this legislation reflects the need to address this issue. Americans' right to know how their taxpayer dollars are being spent. It is time we gave them that transparency. With that, I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to recognize also today a lady who served in this Congress named Cynthia Loomis, and she was the original co-sponsor I had on this bill and worked hard on it and was a very fine representative. And we also work with a man named Lowell Baer. Mr. Baer wrote a book called Inside the Equal Access to Justice Act, Environmental Litigation and the Crippling Battle Over America's Lands. He was a great supporter of this concept, and I want to recognize his efforts as well as Ms. Loomis's, and with that I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
At this time, I would like to yield as much time as she may consume to a gentlelady from Wyoming, our conference chair, who has been a great supporter of this. And actually, I would also be remiss, Mr. Speaker, to not also say that it was her predecessor actually introduced me to this issue, Ms. Loomis, who is always seems to be around, and she keeps this agenda in focus as well. And I just want to say thank you to her for her previous work, and now the very able hands of also Ms. Cheney, who is alongside as a co-sponsor in this. And I yield her as much time as she may consume.
Gentlewoman from Wyoming is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to also thank my colleague and the Republican leader of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Collins, as well as my colleague from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, for their work on this important issue, and Chairman Nadler, of course, for helping to bring this important bill to the floor, and of course echo my colleagues' fond words for my predecessor, Congresswoman Lummis, and all of the work that she did over the years on this issue and so many others for our great state. So I'd like to thank them for the opportunity to speak on this important bill. As you know, Mr. Speaker, the Equal Access to Justice Act was enacted in 1980 for good reason, to ensure that private citizens could make sure that they obtained legal representation in cases against the federal government in cases where it was deserved. While the Equal Access to Justice Act serves that important purpose in holding these federal agencies accountable, in the past 20 years, we have seen this process abused too often by outside organizations. This program was intended to help everyday citizens seek justice, but those seeking profits have also had access to this program, and they've effectively turned the Equal Access to Justice Act into their own personal wallet through frivolous lawsuits. This program was never intended to be a slush fund for serial litigators. Making matters worse, the perversion of the Equal Access to Justice Act is funded by American taxpayers. Americans are footing the legal and attorney's fees of groups that are impeding critical activities, especially on federal lands in my home state of Wyoming and in others. It is clear that the Equal Access to Justice Act needs modernizing, and H.R. 752 is the first step towards that goal. This legislation still affords citizens, organizations, and other affected parties the same right to financial awards in a prevailing lawsuit, but it finally would establish transparency and accountability for these funds. Under H.R. 752, an online database detailing funds awarded to prevailing parties, the agency, and the party involved in the case, and a description of these claims will be made available to the American people. This provides accountability and transparency not only to outside organizations, but to our federal agencies, and most importantly, to the American people. The American people have a right to know how their hard-earned money is spent, and this legislation takes a crucial step towards doing just that. I'm pleased, Mr. Speaker, to support this important legislation, and I urge my colleagues to support it as well. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from Wyoming yields back the balance of her time. Gentleman from Georgia reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
I don't have any further speakers and would be wanting to close.
Can I have no other speakers as well?
I reserve.
All right.
Gentleman from Tennessee reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I thank you for the opportunity, and I thank the gentleman from Tennessee. This is definitely an area in which I look forward to. It should have happened last Congress from my good friend from Tennessee. It's going to happen, I believe, during this Congress. We have both the House and the Senate, and I think this is definitely something the administration will support. Looking forward to this becoming law. This is simply a good bill that opens up transparency and allows us to make better decisions in Congress. That's what we're supposed to be about. And again, I want to thank the friend from Tennessee as being a constant co-sponsor on this. Part of that. And with that, I will yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Georgia yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Tennessee is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I'd just like to thank all the other people, all the members of the Academy and the producers and directors, but also Ranking Member Collins for his continued partnership on this bill, which passed the House last Congress and almost passed the Senate. We always have to remember the enemy is not the Republicans, it's the Senate. I want to thank Representatives Colin Peterson and Liz Cheney for their efforts as well, and urge my colleagues to pass this bill without delay and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Tennessee yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Bill H.R. 752? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion reconsidered is laid on the table.